What is the most influential young earth creationist in the world doing right now? That person would be Ken Ham, right? CEO of Answers in Genesis in Kentucky and the Ark Encounter. And I haven't really caught up. We haven't done an episode of Ham Bites of analyzing something that Ken Ham has said lately. It's not that he hasn't said anything, but it's mostly on rinse and repeat, right? It's the same stuff over and over and over and over again on his social media. But this one caught my eye, and it relates very much to a prior video that I've just recently released and many prior videos to that. One of my favorite topics to talk about: genetic variation, kinds, and diversity, and the origins thereof. So let's take a look at what Ken Ham has had to say just in the last few minutes. Once again, pontificating about how natural selection is a process that occurs but has nothing to do with evolutionary theory. So at the Creation Museum, there's an exhibit on natural selection, the process that evolutionists claim is part of the mechanism for evolution. It's part of the mechanism for evolution. Well, I'm sorry, if you take an evolutionary biology class, you're going to learn about, almost invariably, about 4 mechanisms of evolution. That would be 4 mechanisms that organisms experience as they change and adapt to their environment. And those 4 mechanisms would be, well, you get your mutations, you have natural selection, you have genetic drift, and you have gene flow. So those are the 4 mechanisms that are like the foundation of any evolutionary textbook. So natural selection is one of those. Evolutionary biologists certainly do claim that that is a mechanism of evolution. Of course, Ken Ham is going to try to say here it's not. One of the main examples of natural selection used in student textbooks in public schools to supposedly demonstrate evolution is that of Darwin's finches. It's still a relatively popular example. There are different species of Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Yes. I was taught, I guess presumably 50 years ago or so, although what he's going to say here is okay, that finches from the mainland arrived in the Galapagos and, through natural selection and mutations, became different species of different sizes with different beak sizes. Right? A finch comes to the Galapagos Islands, which are composed of, they're volcanic islands, and so at one point they didn't have any birds on them. So birds had to come from somewhere. They came from South America. At least that's the going hypothesis. And I think everybody, even Ken Ham, accepts that hypothesis. And once on the islands, they, through natural selection and mutations, I would also add through genetic drift and gene flow, or reduction in gene flow, they became different species, of which some species are different sizes, although some species are the same size, and with different beak sizes. Yes, most of the species have different beak sizes. Those wouldn't be the only characters that distinguish species. A single characteristic rarely is going to be definitional for a particular species. However, let's not quibble with those points. Let's keep with the main theme here, the main thing. The main show here is about natural selection and the comparison he's going to make in just a moment, which I have called utterly ridiculous many times in the past. And I'm sure Ken Ham knows that I have said this, and yet he's going to repeat it again. However, as we show in the exhibit, there is far more variation in dog species and breeds than we see in these finches. And no one uses different dog breeds, the result of artificial selection, to claim this is evidence of evolution. I mean, the production of dog breeds from a common ancestor through selection, whether it be artificial or not, mutations, reduction in gene flow. I mean, if you're purebreding a dog and you're not allowing it to breed to another dog lineage, then you are reducing gene flow greatly. You're not allowing the genes to flow between different taxa, and that creates greater differentiation between those two. Right? And I'm sure there's some genetic drift as well, because there are some very, very isolated dog breeds. So the 4 mechanisms of how organisms change their allele frequencies, how they change their genetics, and ultimately change their characteristics over time, all apply to dog breeds. I don't know anyone who wouldn't apply, right, the fact of dog breeds to be evidence that canines have changed over time. albeit I won't use it as an example of similar amounts of change in other natural organisms, as I'm going to show you in just a moment. Well, actually, but let's back up to this first sentence. However, as we show in the exhibit, there is far more variation in dog species and breeds than we see in finches. Now, you want to guess how they show it? Like when you hear the word show, if I were to say, like, I'm going to show you that there is more variation in this particular group of organisms than these, or I'm going to show you there's more variation in this group of people than there is in this other group of people. What do you expect that I'm going to need to show you to provide evidence for my claim? My claim that there's more variation. Right? Might say like, well, if I just look at them, I can tell there's more variation in this group than there is over here. But if you're doing that, you're using relatively superficial traits, right? You're using macroscopic, visible to the eye, exterior features of an organism to claim there's differences between, there's more, I see, in other words, I see more differences between these than I do this other group. But do those external differences, okay, you could count that as a form of variation. I agree. It's morphological variation. And if you have a limited set of characters, like, hey, there's these 10 characteristics having to do with like what I see on the external features of this organism. Like I'm looking at different dog breeds and I see there's big differences in size, coat colors, snout features, tail shape, ears floppy, not floppy, right? You can go down, you can have a list of characteristics and say like, these are my list of characteristics in which I am going to compare these two groups. And then I take these finches over here, like the Galapagos finches, and I look at them with my eye from 20 feet away. And it's like, you know what? They all kind of look similar. Yeah, they got a little bit different beak size. Some are a little bigger and some are a little smaller. But look at this Chihuahua and look at this Great Dane. Huge difference. And that's within just a breed, not much less between species. This is Ken Ham's mind. Ken Ham simply looks at the world and he says, that looks different to me. That doesn't look different to me. Therefore, there's more variation in the thing that looks different than the thing that doesn't look different. But from a biological perspective, is that what's important? Do you read a book by its cover? Aren't the words inside of the book important as well? There's a whole lot of other features. There's a whole lot of other characteristics to an organism. Hundreds of thousands of characteristics, I guess, really, if you add it up. And you're looking at a very tiny fraction of fairly charismatic traits that are external features, right? Beauty is only skin deep. Estimations of variation are only skin deep in this particular case. I would say domestic dog breeds have far less variation than do Darwin's finches. And Darwin's finches are very closely related finches. And then there's 1,500 other finches in the world, and there's a tremendous amount of variation among them. There's very morphological variation, but there's also, more importantly, a lot more genetic variation. There's very little genetic variation between domesticated dogs. So here he's showing, I'm going to show you a couple other images, and then we'll be done because it's just a really quick ham bite today. What evolutionists call natural selection. So what is natural selection to Ken Ham? And again, this is we're beating a dead dog here, but you have to keep repeating it. It's just sorting out of information already present in the DNA of finches. What were they? Finches. What are they? Finches. What will they be? Finches. This is not evolution. It's just finches. A change from one species to another. That's not evolution. You have to understand that he doesn't accept this as evolution. Therefore, if natural selection is doing that, that's not a mechanism of evolution, since this isn't evolution. But back to the variation thing. This is just sorting out of information. So therefore, what he would say is like, there must have been more information loaded into the dog kind, and we've been able to sort it into more more variants, more distinct morphological variants, which we call species. And to him, finches are just finches. They're not really all that different. And they're just tweaking of the original variation, just sorting it into different subsets of variants that we just recognize as being different species. But as you can see here, his impression is that dogs are even more divergent, more different. And he's like, yeah, but I don't see people running around saying, those two dog breeds, look how different they are. That's evidence that evolution can make those giant changes. Because, of course, he's going to come back and say, well, look, they look really different, but they can still breed with each other. So, yeah, I mean, just, the original variation they had can be sorted out. The differences between finches is much more than just I have a population of finches and I sort them into different alleles and then voila, I've got different species. There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of differences, right, between these different species of finches. Many fewer differences between breeds of dogs. Yeah, so let me show you that past post from 2 years ago to show you that he hasn't changed his tune. This is a consistent message. I mean, Ken Ham is, if he is anything else, he is consistent. He isn't consistent in his lack of understanding of evolutionary theory, but most importantly of genetic variation. So we've covered this one before. I did a whole video on poodles, how Ken Ham feels about poodles, which he feels that they're degraded versions of the original, more perfect dog. Right. And so he's like, they're just degenerate mutants. And then he goes on to explain why. And let's just skip down here to the important part. In small dog breeds, a mutation in the sequence next to the gene that keeps them from growing larger, right? So he's talking about, yes, there are mutations. He's admitting there have been mutations, but he calls those degradation mutations, right? Poodles aren't as large as wolves are because they have the mutation that prevents them from growing larger, especially mini poodles. And so that is a change in the original condition of a dog, which is the original perfect condition. And therefore, that is just a loss of information. They're unable to make large versions. Really, it's just a change, right? A change such that they're making a different morphology than they were making before. Some organisms get larger, some can get smaller. It's not like being smaller is degraded compared to being larger. The scientists discovered a mutation that caused certain dog breeds to remain small in size. So my wife had no option but to admit that our dog was a mutant. Well, yes, we all are mutants, by that definition. We all have some variant that isn't the variant that existed in the past at some point. It's like none of us has the exact same mitochondrial genome that all of our ancestor had. And therefore, I could go around and call you a mutant, all right, by Ken Ham's way of speaking. All right, so he goes on and talks about these dogs. They've all been domesticated between 12 and 15,000 years ago. That's way too long for his timeline. He needs all domesticated dogs to have originated in the last 4,500 years since the first canine stepped off of the ark. But nonetheless, he's acknowledging that all domesticated dogs are simply pulled out of wolves and therefore share a common ancestor. Therefore, they share what? A common gene pool. Just like the finches share a common gene pool. So what is the point of this? Well, we've written many times before, yes, that's true. All dogs are one kind, even though there's great variation within dogs. With many different species and varieties within certain species, all of this variation occurs within the dog kind. That's just a way of saying that the canine family has a gene pool, right? We usually think of a species having a gene pool, like that's collectively all the variation that exists in that particular species, the pool of available genetic variation. But if you want to clump together a bunch of species that have a common ancestor, you could say like this whole group has this gene pool. Now the gene pool isn't necessarily all connected together because they may not be able to cross and share those genes, but collectively they have that. So do canines as an entire group have a larger gene pool than a species? Yes. There is a tremendous amount of variation in all of the canines, the 35 living species of canines. Were all those variants and all that variation existed in just two individuals on Noah's Ark? No, absolutely not. Right? You can't compact all that variation into two individuals. This has nothing to do with molecules to man evolution. In other words, his idea is that all that variation already existed, and all that is happening is we're resorting and repackaging. Right? The process of natural selection and speciation results from the redistribution of genetic information or loss of genetic information, or, and he has to admit this here, mutations that act on the information that's already there. Mutations that change some portion of the DNA encoded information and change it to something it wasn't before. Just like I said, every single one of you out there in my audience has a mitochondrial sequence that has changes in it that make it different than our shared ancestor would have had. So every one of those is a mutation. But he's not going to want to acknowledge that that's anything new, right? He's going to say that is a case of corruption. I don't think our mitochondrial genome, by the way, I don't think your mitochondrial genome and my mitochondrial genome function in any significant way better or worse than our shared ancestors did. In which case, those mutations are not corrupting that information. They're simply changing it, but it still functions in the same way, as efficiently. It doesn't matter what that sequence is if you still have the same physical outcome from it. There's no mechanism of brand new information, which never previously existed, to be added to the gene pool of any kind. While we might see different characteristics visible in different species of dogs like wolves, coyotes, and foxes, this is the result of new combinations of information in the original gene pool, not the new information itself. This is the same stuff he's going to say over and over and over again. And search my site, multiple videos about how genetic information is formed, or I'll say new genes, new programs can be added to organisms and shared between programs and adapted and changed over time in organisms. Our domesticated dogs were produced by artificial selection, right? We do the selecting, right? We're the strong selector, and honestly, we're selecting for characteristics that don't make them very well adapted to the natural environment, and so therefore we're selecting. We're not doing natural selection. We're doing like forethought. I want that feature, even if it's not good for the dogs, rather than the environment. In this case, most of our domestic dogs have been selected for mutations, basically mistakes, that we like, but aren't necessarily good for the dog kind. Yes, true. Yeah, that's true. Right? However, nature, the environment that all other organisms are living in, is also selecting for mutations. But in this case, they're selecting for mutations that make the organism better fit for the environment. Therefore, mutations can result in an organism being more fit for its environment and adapt to its environment. That's not a negative feature for that organism to be adapted in that way by mutation. It also means there were no degenerate mutants in the Garden of Eden. None of these mutations that we see could have been in the original genome. And therefore, even when we call our purebred dogs, they're not really purebred, are they? Because they're all selections of mutations that we like. So here's his way of thinking and talking about how organisms adapt and change over time. A poodle is a sin-cursed copy of the original once very good dog that has suffered from the effects of sin. Adam sinned, that somehow changed the world such that the genetic apparatus, when it copies itself, makes mutations. Mutations are things that shouldn't have existed there. It wouldn't have occurred if the way that the world functions hadn't been changed by the curse. And then that makes them become degenerate mutants, right? Which are now living in this fallen world. And living because we're taking care of them. So now take a look at this tweet from a few years back by Ken Ham. The wolf and coyote, I want to go back to my original point, which is Ken Ham, his way of understanding the differences in the world are simply observational. Like I look at it and to me it's different. He doesn't have a scientific way of assessing right? A scientific way of statistically analyzing two different groups and asking, why are they, or how different are they? What's his unit of measure? His unit of measure is, my gut feeling is these dogs are more different. And this particular image is my evidence, okay, that this is how Ken Ham thinks, right? Like I'm trying to, like, I'm using evidence here and I'm bringing you the evidence. The wolf and the coyote are different species. Yes. And evolutionists claim this took thousands of years, actually several 100,000 years. Yet the differences between the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are much greater than they are the same species. And we know that they were bred in the last few hundred years. Evolution is bankrupt. I mean, you can see why he's a good politician, right? The average person doesn't know anything about genetics and so forth, looks at these two pictures, they go, yeah, look, there's a Great Dane, here's a Yorkshire Terrier. Those are really different looking things, right? They're more different looking than two cats, you know, a lion and a tiger. And yet these were separated from each other in just a few hundred years. And look over here, this wolf and this coyote, they're basically kind of interchangeable. Most people might not even be able to tell the difference. We have wolves and coyotes in this region. And I would say many people, they see something, they don't know whether it's a coyote or wolf. And yet they're different species separated by hundreds of thousands of years. See, to Ken Ham, these two are more different. I mean, he says it. Yet the differences between the Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are much greater. How's he measuring that? Oh, because one's bigger, has different coat colors, and one has floppy ears, one has ears straight up, one has a tail that's bent up. All right, so those are a number of characters that make them different. But if you go in and you were to sequence the entire genome of this organism and this organism, and the wolf, right? Sorry, the coyote, and compare them together, no contest. No contest. The Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are 99.999% the same across billions of ATCs and Gs. The wolf and the coyote, probably 10 to 50 million differences. They have some genes that are completely different, right? That one has that other doesn't have. Variations in tons of genes that make lots of differences. Right? Just because they don't make differences in the external appearance doesn't mean that cumulatively they don't have hundreds of other morphological features in terms of their physiology and their how they process food and all that stuff, right? Oh yeah, by the way, like behaviorally, foxes and wolves are very different. How they mate, their mating calls and how they attract each other, pretty different. The Great Dane and the Yorkshire Terrier are still interested in each other. And although physically have trouble reproducing each other, they're perfectly capable of producing an offspring, all right, genetically. So this is just silly. It really is. I can't emphasize enough that this is just silly. And so now this is years ago, and I've done a whole blog post and I did a video basically on this image alone and talked about this before. And so now here comes Ken Ham today, which is why I'm talking about it, because, I see that and I say he's incapable of understanding this. I'll take that back. He's capable of doing it, but it's like a lot of spokespeople. He has said the same thing for so long. He can't really say anything different. He's trapped by his own history of misunderstanding and misinformation. And I think he totally believes it himself, and it's not hard for him to say this. He's just not able to even hear the message and try to even understand. He's not interested. He's not interested in understanding what it means to try to understand variation and what are the measures of variation. What it means to say to a scientist, these are more different than these others. You have to categorize it. You can say on outside visual appearance, my visual inspection of these two, not knowing anything else about their biology, it looks to me like a Great Dane and Yorkshire Terrier are more different than a wolf and a coyote. And I would say, Yes, I agree. They do look like they're more different. But now let's try to understand a little bit about biology. Okay, once we go a little few layers deeper, that's not going to be a true statement anymore. Just saying there are fewer differences, right? Cannot. In other words, he maintains his ignorance. He's retaining his ignorance of biology almost on purpose so that he can give out these vague things that are they're great for people who don't have any understanding, because lots of people look at this and they like it, and hundreds of comments like, yes, of course, it seems intuitive. But just because something's intuitive doesn't make it true. All right. It just means you haven't studied something. You haven't bothered to learn about it. You haven't bothered to be interested enough to care about. I'm going to say, you're not even interested in the truth. Not interested in the truth. So those finches, right? He's saying, again, in his mind, the finches all look similar to each other. Canines don't. Therefore, canines have more variation than finches. And I think I forgot to make this point. I should have made it earlier. In fact, I should have led off with this. So once again, I'm holding the most important point to the very end. Bad move on my part. The most important thing is that the way he presented the finch thing, he says, we show, right, at the Ark Encounter, or I'm sorry, at the Creation Museum, we show in our display. Right. And then he wants to pretend like we have these scientific displays, like we're just like a science museum, except for, for Christians, for young earth creationists. Well, what would I expect from a halfway decent science display? If you're going to show me something, I want to see the evidence. For Ken Ham, he is showing it. He is providing the evidence. Look, we put two pictures here. Here's a picture, or in this case, here are little representatives of these birds, and over here are some pictures of dogs. And you can look at them and it's like, yes, see, we provided the evidence. We provided the evidence that there's more variation in one than the other. It doesn't mean, that does not answer any questions to somebody who wants to know about the evolution of those organisms or the speciation or what how that happened. That is simply attempt to pull the wool over his visitor's eyes. All right, that's it. Little ham bite for now. I say little, but now I'm looking down here and I see I'm at 31 minutes. Yeah, I get excited talking about kinds and biological variation. Thanks for hanging out with me. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we'll see you when we see you.